This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Do our gardens matter when we're faced with a very heavy rainfall? With Dunedin's recent major flooding event in early October, this is one of several relevant questions for us. In this episode of Rewilding in Action, I visit the garden of an urban ecologist to discuss the importance of urban gardens from a broader landscape level, as well as why we should allow our own garden to become that little bit wilder. Kia ora. Welcome to Rewilding in Action with me, your host, Maureen Howard. Today's programme is about garden rewilding, and it's not rewilding in the scientific sense of the word, but it's the term that I'm using to describe what we can do in our gardens to provide more space and habitat for nature, especially natives. Now, Statistics New Zealand has found that 84.2% of New Zealanders now live in an urban area. So I'm going to make it a priority to have an occasional semi-regular episode focused on the urban garden. In this episode of Rewilding in Action, I visit Professor Yolanda van Heezik, an urban ecologist at Otago University, in her garden in the Normanby community of Dunedin. And I ask Yolanda how long she's been here and what changes she's observed.
We've been here about 24 years now, so quite a while. And the garden has changed a lot over that time. I found some old photos when we first bought the house, and it's always amazing to look back and realise what's happened in that time, how much things have grown up, but just how much the composition of the vegetation's changed.
So we're focusing really on the front part of the garden because you've got vegetables in the back and a few fruit trees, haven't you?
Yeah. The whole property's a bit less than 700 square metres, so in the past that would have been quite a small garden, but nowadays, of course, it's actually quite a big garden because properties are becoming much smaller.
Yeah, that's right. And so in this front area, it would be maybe about 250, would you say?
Yeah, I'd say about 250, and it's sort of, there's a flat bit right in front of the house, but then it slopes off quite steeply down to the road. And so that's the area that's all planted out with mostly native trees and shrubs.
So what was it like when you were first here? Was it mostly native in the front?
Well, there were quite a few. Like the developer that created this little subdivision, he did plant quite a few native species, and up the side of the street there are native beech, and there are 4 native beech trees. In fact, there were 5 in our garden, one of which we did have to remove. It was just too big and too close to the house. But also we've got 4 cabbage trees that he planted. But it was a lot sparser when we arrived, and particularly around the back it was just lawn and nothing else. But the previous owners had some big dogs, and I think that it was where the dogs were kept. I don't know if that was the reason why they didn't plant anything, but maybe it was easier just to have lawn.
Yeah, because when we come to a garden, we inherit what's here, and it's a matter of, often some of it's quite useful, isn't it, having a bit of tarmac or whatever? Yeah,
well, especially if you have kids, it's really useful that they can ride on their little scooters or whatever, and play games like cricket. It's quite good to have a bit of lawn then so that they can play, but of course we inherited quite a lot of paved area, which is all asphalt. We've got quite a steep drive and a kind of a turnaround area behind the house, and then a drive into the garage. So I've tried to minimise it by having a lot of pots along the side that, have plants in them. Otherwise it would look pretty stark.
Yeah, actually that's a really good point. I think, so if we are inheriting something or we've moved into a property, we can modify it in certain ways. And even if we're renting, pots are a great alternative, aren't they?
Absolutely, yeah, because you can move them when you leave. A lot of things grow in pots other than the things that you plant in them, so they can be they can provide a lot of resources for insects and bees. And in fact, because I've got fruit trees around the back, I like to always have honeybees in my garden, especially at this time of the year for pollinating them. But I just like to provide bees with food all year round, so I have got some non-natives that attract bees, like lavender and some other species. So yeah, I've got a bit of a mix, but most of the front is native.
Right, and it is very pretty. Yes, and should we just walk over to the little corner section? Sure. Because you've got a lovely selection of ferns here at the bottom underneath your grand cabbage tree.
Yep, it's a fabulous cabbage tree that gets heaps of flowers, and there's a lot of birds using the flowers at that time of the year. And I've planted a tree fern underneath it, but it's not doing terribly well.
It's alive.
It's still alive, only just. I guess it was a bit optimistic. But there are a few ferns at ground level and some hebes, and there's some pseudopanics, some lance-woods and some pittosporums. I think the key thing is that I aim for is to get all these different layers of vegetation, because every layer supports different kind of communities of invertebrates. And so, if you really want to support biodiversity in general, then you need a bit of diversity, but you also need that kind of complexity as well.
That's right. So we do tend to focus at the moment on trees as being the important thing, but it's having all those layers right down to your tiny little hound's tongue ferns they've just popped up themselves, haven't they?
Yep, they did, because it gets quite wet around here. And all the ground cover is great, and then of course the stuff that's on the ground, the dead stuff, the dead wood. When things die, I tend to just leave it on the ground. In fact, I had a dead tree for a while that wasn't on the ground, and I think my mother thought I was completely crazy having this dead tree. Eventually it just fell over, but it wasn't a problem. It was a small dead tree.
No, and it's a really important ecosystem in itself, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
You've got all the fungi and boring beetles and everything that lives in there.
Yep. Yeah, and maybe even, if you're lucky, a peripatus. I've never seen a peripatus here, but they really like rotty logs.
Yeah, that's right. And so tell me, I've known you for a little while now, and I know that gardens are a big focus of yours because you're an urban ecologist, and so you do see that whole connection about bringing nature into where we live. And so tell me a little bit more about why you feel the garden is so important.
Yeah, well, a number of years ago with some colleagues, we did a study on 55 gardens across Dunedin, and we documented all the woody vegetation, but we also interviewed the people who own the houses or live there anyway. And so there was a lot of information that came out of that. And one of the things is that gardens mean a lot of different things to different people. They value them for different reasons. And so I think you have to bear that in mind, or I bear that in mind if I'm talking. Like sometimes I get invited to talk to gardening clubs, then I actually don't push everything has to be native, because people have different aesthetics and also people want to grow food. Private gardens make up about 36% of the cover of Dunedin, so that's a really large area. It's bigger than if you put all the parks and reserves together. And so if everyone just planted their gardens with a few more native species, then it would actually have a really big impact across the whole of Dunedin. And of course that figure's going to go down in the future with the kind of infill development and more medium density development. And so that makes it, in my mind anyway, even more important that people really make the best of the small spaces that they have. And, to kind of think about their suburb the way that a bird might when it's flying over it and looking for somewhere to live or somewhere to build a nest, food to find, and think about how things are connected. And then your garden, then it doesn't have to be a life support on its own, but it can be part of that whole kind of interconnected landscape of resources for birds and other animals.
And do you think that how the things that we do in our gardens then influence our neighbours and what they feel that they can do as well?
Yes, definitely. Absolutely. I mean, sometimes, of course, the neighbours don't like it very much, but you just have to shift the norm. And it's been shown in some studies that this is what happens. There was a really nice study that was done in Fremantle, just near Perth, where, there was a lot of artificial turf instead of lawn, and and there weren't a lot of native species because they tend to be not as colourful, they're a bit grey-green. But it's a bit of an alty kind of township anyway. And some people on the street actually changed and did a native garden thing. And then it just was kind of slowly spread down the street. And in fact, there were some other features that were quite funny, like solar panels. So people started installing rain tanks and solar panels. But the author of that study noted that sometimes the solar panels were actually installed on the side of the house that was visible to the street rather than the side of the house that they should have been on. So it was kind of what he called conspicuous conservation, that people were, signalling, I'm a really good conservationist.
Or you could just even have it unconnected or something like that. Pseudo.
Yeah.
But it tells people what they're allowed to do, or maybe what's socially acceptable to do, and then they can see maybe how green and diverse your garden is and the kind of birds that you're getting.
Yeah. I'm a real supporter of sort of accreditation things where you could have a little sign. That's why we created Garden Star, which is this garden biodiversity evaluation tool. So the way that we'd like to see it used is that, if you have your garden evaluated and if it achieves like a decent score, then you actually get a plaque or something like that. Or I've seen in other countries like the US, you get these little signs that come from particular organisations, so they show an accreditation for maybe the fact that you've got really good vegetation supporting bees. And then you put these in your garden, and those are signals that, okay, you might have a messy garden, but it has a purpose, It's not just that you're lazy or something like that. It's actually there for a reason, and that makes it much more socially acceptable.
Yes, so how can we signal to people that we're not just lazy, apart from having a little plaque on the front of our on our fence?
It comes down to that, yeah. I think, and there's another kind of concept that was identified in the literature from overseas, which is called the cues to care. So it's the idea that you can have a really messy area, but if you say have a mowed edge to it, then it shows that the messy area is meant to be messy, and then it becomes socially acceptable. And
we need to rechange that word messy, don't we? Because it's basically diverse, and it shows you've got your understory layers and you've got your mulch on the ground, with your leaves and twigs and everything like that, and that's all part of the diverse system, isn't it?
I'd like to think that we're moving away from that really manicured look. I think in our garden study, I think that the older people that were part of the study were more likely to really value an extremely manicured garden than the younger ones. So, yeah, I'm hoping it's a generational thing.
I have a feeling it is too. Yes.
Although there is a kind of a trend now which is worrying for low maintenance. So low maintenance often means paved, and I think that's something that will be terrible for the future, because not only for biodiversity, but in terms of we've just had this terrible flooding event, and we just need to make our cities more spongy. And I've noticed, for example, we've just had more rain in 2 days than we've had in 100 years, and I can see the driveway just up past the next neighbour, all the runoff from the hill behind us, which is very well vegetated, running down, and it was running down in a stream like 2 to 3 days after the actual rainfall event. So all of that rain was being soaked up in the bush behind us, and then was being released slowly and as runoff, rather than when it's paved, then everything comes off in this huge gush, and that's why you get a sewer pipe, blowing out somewhere near Ocean View. So we just need to reduce the amount of impermeable surfaces and soak up stuff like that. It's a real nature-based climate mitigation solution.
Absolutely. So those are two of the elements. We've kind of covered like the role your garden plays in that, in terms of the connectivity, and then the wider landscape, and that second value of the or category of permeability. These are two of the ways that you score. Yeah. What are the other two elements?
Well, one is management, and so when, for example, if we're doing a Garden Star evaluation, then there's a survey that we're asking owners questions about things like how many, chemicals they use on the garden, how often they mow their lawn, whether they have a cat, or whether the cat's free roaming or not, things like that. And so that will contribute points to their score if they careful of that bee.
It's adding some aesthetics
Yes,
to
right,
our conversation.
Yeah, so that's quite important. And then so there's permeability. Oh, the vegetation, which is the quality and the diversity of the vegetation.
And would that just be native, or are you looking at all species?
Well, we look at all species because we know that exotic vegetation is often used by native species. But in terms of the point system, then the native species always gets more points than exotic species. But say, if you're looking at an exotic tree, like a full-grown tree, then that would probably score more points than, say, a native ground cover would, I think, because a tree does provide a lot of habitats and resources for a lot of species, even if it is exotic. I think I had a student years ago, Emily, and she was looking at bird use of 3 native and 3 exotic species, and she found that oak trees are just used heavily by lots of species of birds, not just exotic birds. Yeah. Even when the oaks have dropped their leaves, they have this kind of rough bark, and it really it supports a lot of invertebrates, and so you get birds that are gleaning from trunks and branches, using it throughout winter as well. So, yeah, you have to bear that in mind, and we did when we created our evaluation tool. But we do have to support native species, because when we were looking at the proportions of natives across our 55 gardens, I think it's only like maybe 17% of all the species that we recorded were native. It's quite low, so we definitely could be doing a lot better. And when it comes to, like tall trees, that was another, we called anything tall over 5 metres. I can't remember that because it's a few years ago now, but less than half of gardens had a tall tree. They were more often exotic trees than native trees. So there's definitely room to improve the native representation.
Right, and native species tend to attract native birds
and native insects. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, up behind you, on the back of your property, you've got this wonderful hill. And so it's part of your wider landscape, isn't it? It's part of it's covered in gorse, and I'm very excited to see if in 20 years' time that gorse becomes native. I think it will get topped out. And is the rest of it mostly Kanika, is it?
Yeah, it's mostly Kanika. I think actually looking at it from this angle, the Kanika is invading the gorse, because it used to have a much kind of more sort of delineated cut-off point, and you can actually see it integrating through it. So yeah, ultimately I guess it'll become native. And but there's a lot of birds that live up there. Sorry, Maureen's circling me because I keep moving around. There were some very tall old pine trees that the landowner removed, and at the time, even though I'm not a big pine tree fan, I was a bit concerned because they were used as a roost by kiruru. Often there'd be dozens up there, and tui as well. But in fact, they've just moved into the bush behind, so you don't sort of see them in the same, they're kind of spread out more now, I guess. But we've always seen quite a few kiruru up here, like sometimes a flock of 30 or so, which is, I think, quite good for Dunedin.
Oh, it is.
And also you hear moorporks up there at night, which is really cool, yeah.
Oh, that's so exciting. Oh, great. And so your garden actually plays quite an important part in terms of connecting the city, being a connector.
Yeah. But I think we're quite lucky up this part of North East Valley, because there's quite a lot of green. The north end of Dunedin, if you look on a map, is really well connected to other north patches of veg. It's the southern end of Dunedin that's really poorly connected. Yeah,
but the potential is there, always with rewilding, and perhaps in terms of wetland ecosystems. Maybe that's the angle that would be happening down there.
It would be lovely to see them restore at least part of Forbury Park into a wetland. I think that would be fantastic. And I think it's part of the South Dunedin Future plan.
Yeah. So one of the things we can think about our gardens, as well as being a stopping off place for birds and stuff like that, but it's connecting more intact ecosystems with each other, having that connectivity. And it's a really important part of the rewilding movement. One of their 3 central tenets is having that connectivity between more ecosystems. And we think of, like, we've got to the north, we've got the Otago Sanctuary and the spill out from there, and we see what's happened in Wellington, with the kaka that are now a common part. A common part of for people who live in Wellington, part of their lives. So this is part of our future. So, and you're involved with Open View, aren't you? Which is a group that's part of that. Would you see that as part of its vision, connecting the eco sanctuary?
Yes. Although I would say most of the work that is likely to be effective would be from the Halo project, because of course they have traps that connect this part of town. That their traps actually start just up North Road and then extend across the landscape. So that's probably one of the more effective ways of protecting that corridor. But of course, Open View is supporting biodiversity in the valley, and it has a number of projects. But I think at the moment they're more focused on Lindsay Creek, which is great. And Lindsay Creek, it's a lovely stream, and it's just a bit unfortunate that it's quite channelized in some areas, and there aren't any easy solutions to unchannelizing it. But there are other bits that have a lot of value.
That's right, because there's quite a lot of the houses have moved very close to it, haven't they? And their gardens are sort of extending into the creek.
You would be taking people's land off them if you were trying to widen it. But just seeing the value of that widening during the first few days, I've been raining for 2 days at that point. I was down on the campus and I went and looked at the water by the business school. Is it near Harbour Terrace? There's the bridge over the Leith. And of course the regional council widened that, and they've got a lot of native plantings on the side. And when there's a big water event like we've just had, of course the Leith is storming down, but it's not storming nearly as much as it used to. Like, so much of its energy now is actually absorbed into those areas where it's been widened, and it does get high and it submerges all those plants, but then as soon as it drops, and the plants just pop back up again. So to me, it's really interesting seeing how much all of those sort of, I'm not quite sure what it's called, river widening efforts have paid off in terms of the way that the flow is much more mitigated during those kind of events.
And so it's a matter of perhaps, I guess at the council level, be looking for opportunities perhaps to buy land or, to allow this more naturalisation of our watercourses to happen, which we are going to need with as climate change events happen more frequently.
Yeah. I guess the Leith is, I think it's all driven by climate change mitigation and flooding. It's not driven by biodiversity. I think you can leverage a lot of recommendations for improved biodiversity off the nature-based solutions addressing climate change, and that applies across gardens as well, all kind of residential areas.
Well, it's been lovely. We've had a beautiful morning out here in your garden, Yolanda, and it's been very nice with the birds. And thank you very, very much for letting me come along, and all the best with your work. I think it's so important what you're doing. Urban ecology, it's where most people are living. And just that, it's another show, but just having that nature connection is so important for our mental health as much as anything.
Yeah, in fact, I think people have shown that in terms of spending time in nature, that there's a lot of evidence now that it's good for your physical health, not just because you're more fit because you're moving around, but all sorts of reasons, your immune system, but your mental health that's the one that's supported by heaps of evidence. And so if you create a lovely garden that looks wild, then you can go and sit in it and really benefit in many ways. It's just a lovely feeling to see what you've created, or what you've let create itself maybe, if you're rewilding.
I'm very grateful to Professor Yolanda van Heezik for the important service that she's providing to research and promote urban wildlife And if you'd like to find how your garden scores on the Garden Star evaluation, just go to peoplecities.co.nz and look under Resources and Tools. And I think my take-home message from this show is that we need to see our gardens as part of a broader ecological landscape of green spaces that are spread across the city. In particular, as Yolanda says, we need spongy cities to help with our rain events. So keeping this garden landscape mosaic unsealed and green, especially with native plants, plays an important role to mitigate flood events and to connect our city with more intact native ecosystems. And if that's not enough, our green gardens are good for our mental health. So I hope you get the chance to chill out in your garden bench. And it's not being lazy to let nature lead the way. And maybe have a look and see what nature brings to your garden this summer. I'm Maureen Howard, and you've been listening to Rewilding in Action. And in the next episode, I'll be chatting with species reintroduction and rewilding researcher, Professor Phil Seddon, about what rewilding is. And coming in at episode 5, I think it's about time that I had this conversation. And with Phil, I know we'll be in good hands. If you've enjoyed listening to this episode on your podcast app, please, it'd be great if you could hit follow. Till next time, I will leave you to appreciate the delicate bird and traffic soundscape from the urban garden of my guest, Professor Yolanda van Heezik, who is letting nature take the lead.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.